Every army fears enemies from the outside, but the most dangerous threat is the one already inside the walls. In this episode of BattleAnts, we uncover 4 traitors, not predators, not rivals, but ants themselves. They lied, they stole, they poisoned, and they almost brought entire empires to ruin. This is not war from beyond. This is betrayal from within. This is BattleAnts, Episode 5. Deep in the heart of a forest, hidden within a tangled mess of roots and rotten wood, there is a secret entrance to an underground ant colony. Inside this subterranean city lives a queen ant, the mother of thousands. But one day she gave birth to something strange, something that would challenge her power and threaten the very existence of her colony. It was a female ant, but not just any female. This was a female that hatched from a fertilized egg without a father, and so it had no brothers to defend it. It was a lone warrior born into an unforgiving world. But it wasn't just any old ant. It had 2 extra sets of wings and legs, underdeveloped pincers, and a stinger that was far too large for its body. In other words, it looked like a queen. As the colony grew, so did the queen, physically maturing at 3 times the speed of normal ants. She was big, strong, and ready to take over. So when she began to emit special chemicals called pheromones, which are used by ants to communicate, the workers didn't think twice about who they were following. They thought they were serving their queen. They were actually following the imposter. This is the story of the false queen. After taking over the colony, the imposter continued to grow, reaching a size almost equal to the original queen. However, despite its physical resemblance to a queen, it was unable to lay eggs. Therefore, after taking over the colony, it quickly began to lose the respect of the workers. The true queen, meanwhile, gradually regained favor. Nevertheless, the fake queen showed that it could still be useful, since it fought alongside the worker ants and even sometimes took the lead in battles against rival colonies. But what happened next shocked them all. One day, some of the colony's scouts brought back food for the new queen. They laid it down before her, but she didn't eat it. Instead, she began emitting a distress signal. At first, the workers didn't understand what was going on, but then they noticed that the larvae were being fed and that the colony's population began to dwindle. The false queen was taking advantage of her position to hoard food and neglect the colony's young, forcing the workers to abandon her. Finally, the true queen had her revenge. She reclaimed her throne and once again became the colony's main egg layer. Meanwhile, the false queen, now completely alone, wandered through the forest, refusing to eat and slowly starving to death. But this story doesn't end here. You see, this isn't just some fairy tale or made-up myth. It's based on a true story that happened in 2013 in the jungles of Borneo. The protagonist is known simply as Queen R, and we know every detail of her life because of one person, Dr. Alice. Charlotte is a biologist who has devoted her entire career to studying ants, particularly a species known as Phaedo megacephala, or the big-headed ant. These ants live in tropical regions around the world. Their colonies are huge, numbering in the thousands. There are many different types of workers who perform specific tasks. Some guard the nest, while others care for the young or go out foraging. And there's also the soldiers, whose job it is to defend the colony. These are the enforcers who protect the queen and make sure everything runs smoothly. Their name comes from their appearance. They have much larger heads than the rest of the colony, but otherwise look pretty much identical. For decades, scientists believed that these big-headed ants reproduced in the same way as other ants, with the queen laying all the eggs and the males fertilizing her so that each egg would have a father. But in 2013, this idea was turned upside down when Dr. Charlotte discovered something incredible. While studying a colony in Borneo, she found several nests where the queens had mysteriously disappeared. At first, she assumed that they had been eaten by predators or had simply flown away. But soon she realized that something else was going on. There were females in these nests that were larger than the other ants and behaved like queens. But when Dr. Charlotte examined them closely, she noticed that they had 2 extra sets of wings and legs, underdeveloped mandibles, and a giant stinger. In other words, they were clones of the real queen. Not only that, but the workers seemed to obey their orders without question. At first, the biologist couldn't believe what she was seeing. She had never seen anything like it in her years of research. To better understand what was happening, she decided to set up cameras in the lab to monitor the ants around the clock. Thanks to these devices, she was able to capture the moment when the false queen was born. She watched as the clone took over the colony, forced the real queen out, and gradually lost the respect of her subjects. The ants quickly realized that the new leader was infertile, so they began bringing food to the original queen instead. It was a real David and Goliath story, except in this case, Goliath won. To make matters worse, the false queen refused to eat. Perhaps she knew that she didn't deserve the respect of the colony. Perhaps she was simply too proud to beg for food. Whatever the reason, she eventually starved to death, leaving the colony leaderless. After the imposter's death, the workers immediately returned to serving the original queen, who wasted no time in laying eggs and getting the colony back on track. For Dr. Charlotte, this discovery was truly amazing. Not only did it overturn everything she had learned about ant reproduction, but it also provided an opportunity to study how colonies cope with such drastic changes. With this in mind, she repeated the experiment several times, but the results always turned out the same. The imposter queen always ended up dying, and the original queen regained control of the colony. So why do the ants accept the imposter queen in the first place? Why don't they realize that she can't give them more workers? The answer may lie in the chemical warfare used by insects to communicate. Ants release various pheromones into the environment. Some serve as alarm signals, while others help them locate food sources or identify members of their own colony. The substances can be released intentionally or accidentally, and their effects can vary depending on the concentration. For example, alarm pheromones are usually released in very small amounts, while trail pheromones, which ants leave behind as they search for food, are released in much larger quantities. This helps other ants following the trail to recognize it as a food source and not something dangerous like a predator. In the case of the false queen, she most likely emitted a pheromone identical or very similar to that of the real queen. This could explain why the workers accepted her without a fight and began bringing her food. But this tactic didn't work forever. As the colony grew and the imposter failed to produce offspring, the workers probably realized that they were being deceived. That's why they began bringing food to the real queen, slowly starving the fake one. Dr. Charlotte believes that ants are capable of distinguishing between different pheromones, even if they're very similar. It's just that they need some time to figure it out. Perhaps they can sense the difference in concentration or the presence of other substances in the air. This ability is essential for their survival, since they constantly have to distinguish between danger and safety, friend and foe. Studying how ants perceive these chemicals could help scientists develop new pesticides that target specific insects while minimizing harm to beneficial ones. It could also shed light on how social insects in general perceive their environment and communicate with each other. In addition to its scientific value, this discovery has also captured the public imagination. The story of the false queen has been covered by major media outlets and even inspired works of art. But perhaps the most important lesson we can learn from this story is that no matter how powerful or seemingly invincible an individual may be, even a queen can be deposed if she doesn't fulfill her duties. One fake queen nearly erased a bloodline, but the next traitor didn't want the throne. He wanted every last crumb. Part 2. The Food Hoarder, deep in the heart of a colony. Hidden away from prying eyes and mandibles is a secret stash of stolen food. It's enough to sustain one lucky individual for months. But who is it for? Deep in the heart of a colony, hidden away from prying eyes and mandibles, is a secret stash of stolen food. It's enough to sustain one lucky individual for months. But who is it for? One day, the hoarders are discovered, but they won't be for long because their stashes are so well hidden. Even then, it'll take some time before the truth comes out. But how will the other ants find out? And why does that matter? This is the story of the food hoarder and how one ant starved hundreds in secret. Once upon a time, deep within an anthill in South Africa, there lived a community of red driver ants. They were a medium-sized species with a big attitude, known for their ferocious defense of their colonies and their massive jaws. These ants live in huge colonies of up to 500,000 individuals. It's hard to keep track of everybody, so they divide the labor between workers, soldiers, and the queen. The workers forage for food and the soldiers protect both the foraging ants and the eggs and larvae that will become the next generation of ants. Their size and fierce nature make them incredibly effective bodyguards. If anything or anyone tries to eat the larvae, they have powerful jaws that can deliver a crushing bite and tear the invader to shreds. But for all their impressive traits, even this ant colony had problems. For example, sometimes workers come back from a foraging trip without any food. And that's not good news because if they don't bring food back, the colony could starve. Sometimes these starving workers aren't lazy. though sometimes it means the foraging party has run into another colony of ants and lost. But other times the worker doesn't even need to leave the nest to go hungry. You see, there's been a food thief at work in the colony. Every day, one worker would sneak off while everyone else was busy. And when no one was looking, it would grab some of the food meant for the larvae and take it somewhere else. At first, the theft went unnoticed. After all, when you're in a colony of 500,000 ants, it's impossible to know what every single one is doing at all times. But soon, the thefts added up and the consequences became obvious. Some of the larvae started to die. The soldiers didn't have enough nutrition to grow up into healthy adults, and the colony's population started to shrink. It wasn't just that the larvae weren't getting enough to eat, it was also that the thief was taking the best food. You see, the larvae are picky eaters. They only want the fattiest, most nutritious parts of the insects the ants catch. They don't want the wings or legs. They only want the soft innards, like the brain and the gut. This made sense. If you were a larva, wouldn't you want the most nutritious parts of the meal, too? But it meant that the thief was making sure that the larvae got the worst parts of the insects they ate, which led to more deaths. Of course, the thief was taking the best parts of the insects for themselves. They were probably the fittest ant in the colony and hoarding food to make sure they stayed that way. That way they could continue to outcompete every other ant in the colony for food, mates, and status. But while the hoarder was happy, the colony wasn't doing well. Now, the larvae were starting to get sick and the colony was weaker than ever, and that's when the discovery was made. As the colony grew weaker, things started to fall apart. The foragers couldn't gather as much food and the soldiers couldn't defend the colony as well. And when that happened, other colonies of ants started to attack. They were drawn to the scent of dying ants and eager to pick off the weak. In the chaos of battle, a soldier ant wandered into a tunnel and found something amazing. Hidden inside was a secret chamber filled with stolen food, the very food that had caused the colony so many problems. Now, at this point, you might think the soldiers would share this food with the rest of the colony, right? Like after all, they had been lied to by the forager. The forager had claimed that they couldn't find any food, when really, they were eating it all themselves. So, wouldn't it make sense for the soldiers to share the hoarded food with the rest of the colony? But it turns out that doesn't happen in real life. When those soldiers discovered the trove of stolen food, they did something different. They took the food and threw it into the tunnels leading outside the nest. They effectively robbed the robber and gave the food to the enemy. These ants didn't know that what they were doing was helping the colony. They were acting purely out of self-interest, but it was still helpful. But why do ants do this? Well, it has to do with the fact that each individual ant acts in its own best interests. Their actions benefit the colony as a whole, but only because so many ants act this way. If even one individual ant acted differently and didn't look out for itself, then the colony would collapse. In the case of those soldiers throwing the food away, they weren't helping the colony, they were protecting their own interests. By throwing the food away, they were weakening the other colonies attacking them, and that meant that they had an easier time defending the colony. Now, there's a lesson in here somewhere about the greater good and acting in your own self-interest, but we'll let you figure that out on your own. For now, we're going to focus on the hoarder because it turns out that they were never really the bad guy. You see, after the discovery of the secret stash of food, everyone assumed that the hoarder must have been driven by greed. And maybe they were, but it turns out they were driven by something else, something worse, something that would make any horror movie fan's skin crawl: parasites. As it turned out, the hoarder had been infected by a kind of zombifying fungus. The fungus had infected the hoarder long ago, but it hadn't shown any symptoms until now. As the fungus spread through the hoarder's body, it started to take over its mind. The fungus made the hoarder crave more and more food, and it sent the hoarder into hiding to stash its food. The fungus needed all of this extra food because it was growing a fruiting body, the part of the fungus that produces spores and spreads the infection to others. But the fungus didn't stop there. As it grew, it also started to turn the hoarder aggressive, which is why the hoarder attacked anyone who found their stash of food. The fungus needed to make sure that no one else ate its food before it had a chance to spread. Luckily for the colony, the soldiers were able to kill the infected hoarder before it could infect anyone else. But the damage was done. The hoarder had starved hundreds of ants, all for nothing. Now, this isn't the first time we've covered a similar situation. There was another study conducted in 2017 that found that the so-called selfish herd behavior was actually altruism. You see, when a group of animals huddles together, The outside animals are more vulnerable than the ones in the middle, so sometimes the animals on the outside will push their way to the inside of the huddle. This reduces their own comfort, but it helps the others. Turns out this happens in lots of species, but it doesn't happen because the animals are being nice. It's actually because they're acting in their own best interest. By moving to the inside of the herd, the animal reduces the chances that it will be eaten, and that increases its chance of passing on its genes. So what does this tell us about the world? Well, it tells us that sometimes things aren't what they seem. An altruistic behavior can actually be driven by selfishness, and a selfish behavior can actually be driven by selflessness. The difference is that sometimes it pays to act in the best interest of others, even if you don't mean to. Sometimes it does. Hunger is deadly, but confusion can be worse. When paths disappear, and no one knows who to follow. Part 3. The signal jammer. Deep in the Amazon rainforest, an unseen battle is being waged between two rival colonies of leafcutter ants. It's a war that's been going on for centuries with no end in sight. But one day, something goes horribly wrong for one of the colonies. Their entire colony goes blind. Not just the ants that were outside foraging, but all of them. The blind ants don't just fall into chaos, they fall into a far worse fate. They all die. And it only took one ant to do it. Hi, and welcome to my channel. Today we're going to look at the signal jammer, an incredible new superpower of the leafcutter ant. If you've ever seen a leafcutter ant before, you may have noticed that they come in 3 different colors. You've got your black garden variety leafcutter ant, your red leafcutter ant, and your weird brown transparent looking ghost leafcutter ant. The differences between the red and black are pretty obvious. The red is bigger and has more teeth. But what about the ghost? What makes them look like that? Well, their see-through undersides make them very good at camouflage. But the most important thing about the ghost ant is what you can't see, their exoskeleton. See, these ants are actually blind. They completely lack the ability to see. And it wasn't always like this. There's evidence that their ancestors used to have eyes and could see, but they lost the ability sometime in the last few million years. Some scientists think it might be because of how deep in the forest and dark it gets that natural selection just didn't see much need for eyes. Or maybe it was related to the way they farm fungus. Whatever the reason, today there are hundreds of species of blind cave-dwelling leafcutter ants, spread out over 3 different continents. They live entirely in the dark, so it doesn't really matter that they can't see. That is, until now. See, the blind ants aren't the only ones who've gotten a cool new superpower. Somewhere in the forest, a second colony of leafcutter ants is also evolving a new ability. This colony is not blind, but they're also not related to the blind ants. These ants are just a normal colony of leafcutter ants trying to survive like any other. But while the blind ants were getting their superpower, so were they. In fact, it's the same superpower as the blind ants, but it's kind of like one of those magic items where it's only half as good unless you use it the right way. You see, leafcutter ants communicate using pheromones. Pheromones are chemicals that animals release into the environment that affect the behavior of others, of their species. Ants have lots of different kinds of pheromones for different purposes. There's alarm pheromones, which tell other ants to run away when danger's near. Trail pheromones, which tell other ants where food is, and even recognition pheromones, which allow ants to recognize each other as part of the colony. But for our story, there's another kind of pheromone that matters. Jammers. Jammers are basically the opposite of trail pheromones. Instead of showing ants where food is, they show ants nowhere. They don't cause any immediate reaction like alarm pheromones. Instead, they gradually confuse ants, causing them to lose their memory and wander around aimlessly, until they basically bump into something or someone else. At which point, if they're lucky, they might smell the danger before it's too late. Now, normally, ants don't produce jammers. That would be like a worker bee deciding to lay eggs. Sure, it happens sometimes, but it's rare, and when it does, everyone freaks out. But sometimes, that rogue ant might be onto something. Sometimes, that egg-laying worker bee is actually the best thing that could have happened to the hive. You see, those jammers that the worker ants were producing weren't actually theirs. Instead, they were produced by parasites called phorid flies. These little flies are the natural enemy of the leafcutter ant. They lay their eggs inside the living ants, and when they hatch, they kill the ant and fly off to find another one to lay their eggs in. So it's no surprise that the ants have evolved a defense against these little flies. When a leafcutter ant smells a jammer, it knows that somewhere nearby a ferret fly has laid its eggs and is killing ants. So the ants quickly set to work. searching every inch of the nest to find and destroy those fly eggs before they hatch. Usually this works really well, and the ants win the battle, but sometimes a rogue ant comes along with a twist. You see, some of these rogues aren't infected with the ferrate flies at all. Instead, they're carrying a copy of the jamming pheromone. Now the other ants don't know this, so they set to work sniffing around looking for the source of the fake jamming pheromone. But it's everywhere and nowhere. The rogues move around constantly, and when the ants finally find them, it's too late. The rogues spread their wings and fly off, tricking the ants into thinking that they're actually ferrate flies. But these rogues weren't always leafcutter ants. Instead, they started off as a different species entirely. Over time, they've evolved to mimic the behavior of leafcutter ants. And those ferrate fly eggs, they never had any to begin with. Instead, they carry around the eggs of their arch-enemies, the tamale ants. See, the tamale ant is the natural enemy of the leafcutter ant. They fight over territory and food, and occasionally straight up invade each other's nests. So the rogues sneak into the enemy nest, drop off their eggs, and fly back to their own nest. Then they just wait. Within hours, the taming ants start attacking the leaf-cutting ants, and soon, the whole colony is at war with itself. Normally, the leaf-cutters' colony would easily win this war, but with the rogues running around spreading jamming pheromones, the leaf-cutters' coordination breaks down and they can't defend themselves. Soon, the colony is in ruins. The rogues' plan is complete. And to top it all off, the rogues were actually the ones who originally evolved the jamming pheromone in the first place. But why? Why did they bother evolving such a complicated and dangerous strategy? Well, it turns out that this whole thing is just an accident. The original strategy was actually designed to let the rogues enter the leafcutter nests undetected. You see, back then, the rogues were just another species of ant, but they wanted to start stealing the leafcutters' food. And since the leafcutter ants were so much stronger than they needed a way to get close without being attacked. So they decided to start releasing jammers, which would mess with the leafcutters' memory and let them walk right by. But over time, as the rogues moved in and took over more and more leafcutter nests, the leafcutter ants fought back, fighting harder and harder until eventually the rogues were forced to evolve to survive. They ended up moving into the deep forest where the light barely reaches, and there they became blind. And that's how the world got another species of blind cave-dwelling ant. But there's a reason I didn't call this video the blind maker. See, the rogues actually didn't go extinct. Instead, they're still out there, and they're still waging war against the leafcutter ants. Except now they're doing it in the sky. That's right. While the blind ants were getting their superpower, so were the rogues, except theirs was a much better one. Somehow they managed to evolve wings, and with those wings, they flew away from the leafcutter ants forever. And with them, they took their superpower, leaving the leafcutter ants to stumble around in the darkness, doomed to wander around until they starved to death. Well, not all of them. Actually, it turns out the rogues aren't using their powers anymore. After millions of years of natural selection, it turns out the power is just not worth it. For one, having wings is expensive. You need lots of energy to fly. And with all that energy, you can't afford to waste time making jammers. Plus, flying ants are easy prey for birds, so they're not around for very long anyway. Most of the time, the rogues don't even bother with wings, even though they can. So next time you see a leafcutter ant, ask yourself, are they the real leafcutter ants? Or are they the rogues? I honestly couldn't tell you. Anyway, thanks for watching. Trails were lost, battles were fought in the dark. But sometimes betrayal comes with a smile and a mouthful of poison. Part 4. The Poison Feeder, the life of an ant colony, revolves around the queen. She lays the eggs, giving birth to the colony's future workers and soldiers. And she does this in such a way that she essentially owns each one of them. Each egg cell contains a chemical that programs the developing embryo to be either a worker or a soldier. The queen ant doesn't have to worry about anything herself. Her daughters take care of everything from foraging for food to defending her from threats. But what happens if one of these daughters turns against her? This happened in South Africa recently, when researchers at Northwest University noticed that something was wrong with a particularly aggressive colony of driver ants. They brought them back to the lab. Driver ants are among the largest ant species in the world. They can grow up to half an inch long, which makes them about the size of your finger. They get their name from their habit of driving other insects, including termites and other ants, out of their nests. But this particular colony didn't seem to want to drive anything out. Even though their colony had been disturbed and split into multiple pieces, the ants remained docile. That wasn't like them at all, and it meant that something was wrong. In the wild, when a driver ant colony splits, a civil war often erupts between the two new colonies. The combatants are fierce and merciless, often killing every single member of the other side. But these ants weren't fighting. They were just sitting there, and that got the researchers worried, because it meant the queen might have died. Without a queen, the colony would collapse, and even worse, it could leave behind hundreds of eggs that wouldn't hatch. But when the researchers split the colony open, they found that the queen was still alive. She was just really weak. Every time the researchers tried to pick her up, she crumbled into a pile of dust. It seemed like she'd been starving, but she hadn't touched any of the food they'd put in the colony. Then one of the researchers noticed that one of the ants kept approaching the queen and dropping something off near her. At first, he thought it was food, but as he watched more closely, he realized that the ant wasn't depositing food. It was depositing something else, something that looked like dirt. At first, the researchers thought the ant must have stolen food from another colony and was trying to eat it alone, but soon they noticed that the ant wasn't taking any of the stuff. It dropped near the queen, and it wasn't bringing food for the rest of the colony either. All the dirt it brought ended up near the queen. It became clear to the researchers that this ant was actually feeding the queen. But why did it bring her dirt instead of food? Why did it bring her death instead of sustenance? It turned out that the feeder ant wasn't bringing the queen poison. It was bringing her water. Somehow, over time, it had started thinking that the water was poison, and so it had taken it upon itself to poison the colony's queen. But how on earth did the poor little ant come to this conclusion? To understand what happened next, we need to take a look at some earlier research on driver ants. In 2011, scientists dissected several of these massive ants and found that they contained the eggs of a parasitic wasp called the Ekman wasp. The Ekman wasp lays its eggs inside the bodies of other insects, and the larvae feed on their hosts until they're ready to pupa. Then they make a hole in the body of the dead insect and emerge as fully grown wasps, ready to lay their own eggs. It's a brutal existence, and the Ekman wasp is a terrifying creature. There are over 100,000 different species of them, and they prey on almost all kinds of insects, including bees, beetles, butterflies, and yes, ants. Some scientists believe that a pregnant wasp snuck into the nest and laid its eggs before the queen had sealed the deal. Others think the wasp managed to paralyze the queen and lay its eggs inside her abdomen. Either way, the eggs hatched and grew, slowly poisoning the colony's queen. Now, the Ekman wasp isn't a complicated creature. It doesn't build hives or forage for food. It just lays eggs and then dies. But it's also not an especially smart creature. When it hatches from an egg inside another insect, it doesn't know that it is supposed to make a hole in the dead body of its host. Sometimes it tries to carry the dead body with it or even eat it. Its instincts tell it to kill the host, but not how to kill the host. So the wasp is basically just acting on pure instinct. And the same thing must have happened here. Something in the wasp's genes told it to poison the queen, but it didn't know how. So it started bringing her things that it thought were poison. At first, it brought her food. Food, after all, is what kills most people, so it probably seemed like a good place to start. But that didn't work. The queen just stopped eating. So the wasp switched tactics and started bringing the queen dead insects. Again, this seems like a pretty straightforward way to murder someone, but it didn't work. The queen simply stopped reacting to the dead insects. Maybe she was too far gone for that to affect her. Maybe she had developed some resistance to insect toxin. All we do know is that the wasp persisted and eventually the queen started dying. But she didn't just die. As she got weaker and weaker, her abdomen started to swell up. That's because her body had become a breeding ground for thousands of eggs. She was laying them without realizing it. The fertilized eggs were being produced, but now they would never hatch. Each time the queen laid an egg, the wasp would rush over and deposit a small amount of dirt on the egg. The dirt didn't kill the eggs, but it prevented them from being fertilized. Without the sperm from the colony's male ants, the eggs couldn't develop into future workers or soldiers. Soon, all of the queen's eggs began to turn black and die. Meanwhile, the wasp continued to bring her food, assuming that she just needed more poison to finish the job. Finally, when the queen was nothing more than a shell of her former self, the wasp brought her a large piece of dirt and dropped it on top of her. For some reason, the queen exploded. Not really, but she did release a massive amount of the dead eggs from her abdomen, and the wasp must have thought it was finally successful. It scurried away, probably to find a new host to parasite. The queen died surrounded by thousands of dead eggs. Now, If the eggs hadn't died, they might have grown into a new colony. Instead, the only thing left to carry on the colony's bloodline was a small piece of dirt with a single wasp egg still stuck to it. As soon as the other ants realized that the queen was dead, a battle for the throne erupted. Workers fought tooth and nail, biting off each other's limbs and tearing out each other's eyes. But ultimately, only one female would emerge victorious. She would mate with the colony's males, begin laying eggs, and become the new queen. When the researchers returned to the colony a few days later, they found that she was already laying unfertilized eggs. The cycle of violence had begun anew, and now you know why the caretaker became the killer. Not all traitors carry weapons. Some carry food, some carry scent, and some carry silence. The ant kingdom fell 4 times in one story. Not by force, but by trust. The war isn't always outside. Sometimes, it's already in the heart of the colony. Subscribe to BattleAnts and uncover the next betrayal before it's too late.